So today we're going to be exploring living in alignment. And what does it mean when we say we want to live in alignment? And probably the most aligned system in the universe has to be nature. So if you were to sit and watch a sunrise, you just take that as a simple experience and enjoy the moment. But for that to actually occur, there are a lot of things that have to line up. So the sun sits at the center of the solar system, the earth is rotating on its axis, and then right at that very point when we see the sunrise, that is the sun just popping its head over the horizon. And I think it's wonderful, and yet all these things have to line up for us to have that special experience. In our bodies, we've got, I think it's 8 ganglion systems, and they're individual systems that all kind of work together. So we've got the circulatory system, we've got the respiratory system, and for those parts of our bodies to work, they have to line up as well. And then the 8 systems all have to work in together. So the experience we have when they're all in alignment is we feel healthy, we feel full of life and full of energy. So the other morning, I had to be somewhere very early, and I had to leave the house at 6 a.m. And it just happened to be that extremely cold morning. You probably had it here as well. And so as I was going down in the elevator, I had in the back of my mind, well, I just wonder if the car's going to start, because it was so cold. And I went out into the street and looked at the car. It was covered in ice. And so my husband scraped the ice off the car for me. We got in. And, I have a really good relationship with my car. I know this might sound strange, but whenever I complete a trip, I put my hand on the dashboard and I say, "Thank you, car." And so I thought, well, this morning I'm going to do it before the trip. I thought that would be a good idea. So I put my hand on the dashboard. "Thank you, car." Put the key in the ignition. Just started up perfectly, no problem at all. So I knew the car was like really in alignment. Everything was going well that morning, so it was great. And so we kind of know how things go when things are in alignment. It's pretty good. And I'm seeing red, so I imagine there's quite a few Chiefs fans in the room. Is that correct? Yes? So I imagine that you guys are hoping and praying that the Chiefs are in alignment tonight. Is that right? Yeah, so lately you might have noticed that there's been quite a bit of funny things happening in the weather. So the weather doesn't feel so in alignment these days, and we're seeing a lot more storms, and there's all the rising of the temperatures on the earth, and the glaciers are melting, and nature's kind of getting this sense of not quite being in order, not the order that we're used to. If our bodies are not lining up well, if our circulatory system's not working, we might have high blood pressure or low blood pressure, or maybe even some heart problems. So we know what that can feel like when the body's out of order. And we certainly know what it feels like if we don't get the car tuned up. It might not start on those cold mornings. So every day we have this experience of what's in alignment and what's out of alignment. And maybe we don't think about it too much, but we are experiencing it all the time. Now, some people have said to me lately that they're very concerned about what's going on in the world at the moment. So, there's climate change, and that's a big worry for some people. They're wondering what's going to happen. There's the war in Ukraine. We've been seeing some things happen in Turkey and Syria over the last few days. And then, of course, there's politics. Why can't the politicians just be in agreement with each other? So we get a sense that somehow the world is a little bit out of order. And so it's no surprise that sometimes we feel anxious about that. Maybe it's just under the surface there. We don't quite know why we feel that way, a bit of stress or a bit of tension. But certainly when the world is out of order, it makes sense that there's times when we're going to feel out of order as well. So, however you get your news and find out what's happening in the world, maybe it's on the nightly news, or it could be Facebook or a podcast, or you read an online article, however you do it, we have to watch what we're consuming, because when we consume something, we take it in. Just like if I was to take an apple and eat it, I consume it, and it becomes a part of me. So that's what we do when we eat food. We consume it, we take the nutrients out of it, it gives us energy, and it becomes a part of us. And it's exactly the same with the media. We take it on, we consume it, it becomes part of us. So we've got to watch that. And if we're feeling a little bit stressed or a bit tense about what's going on there, we need to notice that and be aware of it. So in unity, we interpret the scriptures symbolically, and whenever we read of eating something in the scriptures, it's all about this. It's about not just eating food, but it's about taking in something. And one of the greatest stories that is an example of that is the feeding of the 5,000. And so the story goes that there were 5,000 people. Maybe there were and maybe there weren't, but we get the idea. There was lots of people, and there they were listening to Jesus speaking, and they were taking in or consuming the spiritual ideas that he was talking about. And so at the end of that day, they were hungry and they wanted to be fed. And Jesus said, well, I've got a few fish here, and I've got some loaves of bread. And the disciples looked at those few fish and loaves and saw the 5,000 people, and they said, well, that is not going to be enough food. And of course, the disciples are really, they represent us. So if 5,000 people turned up here to church this morning, who does morning tea here? Yeah, I see some hands. So whoever does morning tea is probably going to think, oh no, we've got a catering crisis. There is not going to be enough morning tea, and that's understandable, right? But Jesus is really our faith aspect. And in this story, he represents that part of us that has faith beyond just what we see. So he says to the disciples, hand out the food, there will be enough. And so they start to hand out the loaves and the fishes. And the story tells us that the loaves and the fishes multiply. And then there's plenty of food for everyone. And it also tells us there's some left over. So this is a very important story because it's really teaching us about the law of abundance. And so the story says, well, there's always enough and more. Can you say that? There is always enough and more. And tell the person next to you, there is always enough and more. So what great symbolism we find in this story. Noticing what we're consuming. And the story tells us also that when we consume something, just like if I take the apple and I eat it, I'm really changing its substance because it's not an apple anymore. It's become a part of me. Now, that's really important because that tells us that we have the power to change substance. So I want you to say, I have the power to change substance.
I have the power to change substance.
Wonderful. Now tell someone on the other side of the room. Shout it out. I have the power to change substance. So this morning, we're not going to hand out any loaves or fishes, but we kind of do it differently. Every Sunday, you do this thing called the love offering blessing. Now, what are the words in the love offering blessing? Divine love through me blesses and multiplies all that I have, all that I give, and all that I receive. So isn't that the loaves and the fishes? Yeah, aren't we aligning ourselves for what I like to call the multiplication factor, which is the law of abundance. So every Sunday when you say that, you're lining yourself up to be in alignment with the law of abundance. And so we're living in alignment, and we're noticing what we're consuming. We know there is always enough and more, right? Do you agree with that? Yes? And we know that we have the power to change substance. Another thing we can do to get ourselves in alignment is to really notice where we're at, to notice how we're feeling, to notice if we feel agitated or a bit anxious by things, just having a really good understanding of ourselves. And many years ago, I used to spend a lot of time at an ashram, and I'd go for a weekend or a week or two. But there was a girl there that used to stay for very long periods of time. So she'd be there for like 6 months at a time. And I didn't really know her when I first went. But over the years, she'd tell me a little bit about her life, and I'd learn this thing and then that thing. And then eventually I got the full picture. I didn't really know why she was staying there for such a long time. So she told me that she had spent time in a psychiatric hospital, that she'd had electric shock treatment. Then she told me she was schizophrenic, and that she'd been married and she had a daughter, and then she'd gotten divorced, and she'd given the daughter to the husband to bring up because she didn't feel that she could bring her up well. And as I got to know this story, I thought, what a tragic story, really. And yet she was so happy and at peace with life. And I really admired how she dealt with this whole thing. So she would come to the ashram to manage her condition. And she'd spend the 6 months there. And then when she felt that she was up to going out into the real world, she'd go and just live at, like anyone else, just a normal life. So one day I said to her, well, how do you know when to come back into the ashram? And she said, oh, I noticed that I start to lose things. And when I lose my handbag, so I can't find my keys and my money, then I know it's time to go back. So I actually learned a valuable lesson from that. It's really important to know where you're at. And so I'm going to ask you, where are you at right now? Where are you at in yourself, in your feeling, in your life? Ask yourself, what are you feeling? What do you love in your life? What do you hate in your life? What are you thinking? What are you watching? What are you reading? What are you talking about? Because that's important, to know right where you're at. Eric Butterworth used to say, life begins at the point of us. I love that. Life begins at the point of us. So we got to know ourselves before we worry about all the other stuff. He talks about this. He says, if you're experiencing disorder, then you have the choice to turn away from the outside world and to turn within. And if we allow ourselves to go down deep, we're going to find this thing that we often talk about, and it's called divine order. And I'll tell you something about divine order. Divine order is always in order. So think about that for a moment. Say after me, divine order is always in order. Yes, and it sounds simple, but how important is it to really know that? Divine order is always in order, and it's always within you. When you're right with yourself, everything in life will be right with you. And divine order, we really experience as a sense of great inner harmony, inner joy, inner love, inner peace. And you can't get that out there. The inner experience is just so much deeper because it's God in you. And so when you're at peace with yourself, everything and everyone will be at peace with you. And what's that song that we sing every Sunday? We call it the peace song. How does it go? Let there be peace, and let it begin with me. You see? I know some of you think we do these old-fashioned things for no reason, but there's wonderful reasons why we sing this song and why we do a love offering. It's always aligning us. It's always giving us a message that we need to be aware of. And so the word align is a verb, and I learnt at school that a verb is a doing word. Anyone else learn that at school? It's a doing word. So that means we can't just think about aligning ourselves or talk about it, we have to do it. And there are many practices that we can do that get us into alignment. Eric Butterworth, in his book, Spiritual Economics, he writes about tithing. And I remember the first time I read this, I went, what? He says, well, let's hear less of tithing and more of giving. Let's not be deluded by claims of the magic law of tithing. That's where I went, it's not real. Tithing isn't real. And until I read the next section, and this is what he says, tithing is not a law, but it is a technique for fulfilling the law of giving. And so he's talking about the practices that we do, the practice of tithing, which gets us into that consciousness of giving, gets us into the flow of life. You know, the other night I was watching a surfing documentary. I don't usually watch surfing documentaries, but it caught my attention because there was a famous Australian surfer who was being interviewed. And she had won a lot of big competitions. And the interviewer said to her, tell me, Steffi, you know, what do you do when you go in the competition? And she said, oh, well, I line myself up with the wave, and then I just have to be one with the wave. And as soon as I feel any resistance, I know I'm out of the competition. I thought, wow, that's kind of like life. You want to be one with life. You want to be with that kind of flow of life. And so we tithe because it's a practice and it gets us into a giving consciousness. We pray because it gets us into a prayer consciousness. And when we pray, we speak words of truth. And I'm talking about truth with a capital T. So we're aligning ourselves with truth. We meditate because it's a practice that gets us into a listening consciousness. And what are we listening for? We're listening for divine guidance. Emily Cady, in her book Lessons in Truth, says that these things that you see out there are not real. She says they're temporary and they pass away. And it's so easy for us to see all the faults and the failures of people, the lack, the problems, the limitations in circumstances, and they all seem real to us, don't they? Yeah, they seem real. And she says, you know, this is how we become unhappy and sick. And that all we have to do is turn our thoughts away from the external and to go inwards, towards the spiritual, and dwell on the spiritual things. And she says, if you can do that, all the negativity in your mind is going to drop away, and then it's just going to drop out of your life. In Philippians, Paul says, finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, and whatever is commendable, think about these things. And so here we are. We have the choice to live in alignment. We can take notice of what we're consuming. We can just have an awareness of where we're at. And we can do the practices, the prayer, the meditation, the love offering. We can sing the peace song together and just know that when we're doing that, we are practicing to get ourselves in alignment with divine mind. Emily Cady says, well, just imagine this. Imagine there's a great reservoir of water, and coming from that reservoir are these channels that reach out, and then at the end of each channel is a fountain. So you get the idea, the water's flowing in the reservoir, it's going through the channel, it's going into the fountain and flowing through. And she says, well, the fountains are us. This is about our relationship with God. So we're independent, we're individual, and yet we're connected to this great reservoir. We can always be replenished. We can always be refreshed. And so there's no lack or limitation in truth. We're constantly being renewed, constantly being refreshed. God's energy is always present, and you always have the power to bring yourself into alignment with that energy, because you simply are divine energy in physical form. And so it is.